How much of me was ever mine? Welcome to the Archeion, where curiosity becomes knowledge. I'm Asriel. Have you ever caught yourself reacting to something and then wondered why you reacted that way? Maybe someone takes a little longer than usual to reply to a message, and before you know it, you've already imagined 10 different reasons why. Or someone offers to help you, and your first instinct is to say, "No, I'm fine," even when you're overwhelmed. Maybe you apologize for things that don't really require an apology. Or maybe you keep chasing the same kind of relationship, the same kind of goal, the same kind of approval, without ever stopping to ask why it feels so important. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, not because I think there's something wrong with us, but because I wonder how often we mistake familiarity for identity. There are parts of ourselves that feel so natural, so automatic, that we rarely question them. We say things like, "That's just who I am." We tell ourselves we've always been this way. We assume the story is finished, but what if it isn't? What if some of the things we call our personality began as something else entirely? What if they started as ways of adapting to the world we happen to grow up in? I've been reading and reflecting on this idea recently, and one question has stayed with me long after I closed the book and walked away from my desk. It's a simple question, but the more I sit with it, the bigger it seems to become. How much of who I am did I actually choose? Not just the obvious things, not the career, not the hobbies, and not the music I listen to. And I mean something deeper. Did I choose the way I protect myself? Did I choose the things I fear? Did I choose the way I love? Did I choose the dreams I keep chasing? Or did I arrive in a world that was already shaping me before I even knew I was being shaped? I don't think I have an answer, but I do think it's a question worth spending some time with. So today, I'd simply like to think through it together. I think one of the reasons this question feels so important is because most of us spend a surprising amount of our lives trying to understand ourselves. We read personality tests, we learn about attachment styles, we hear words like introvert, empath, perfectionist, people pleaser, avoidant. Sometimes those ideas genuinely help us make sense of our experiences. But I've also noticed something else. Sometimes we become so attached to the labels we use to describe ourselves that we stop asking where those patterns came from in the first place. I've always been anxious. I'm just independent. I don't trust people. I'm bad at expressing emotions. I'm not good enough. These sentences can become so familiar that they almost sound like facts. And maybe some of them describe us accurately, but I wonder if they tell the whole story. Because none of us begin life as a completely blank slate. Before we ever make our first meaningful decision, we've already inherited so much: a family, a language, a culture, certain expectations, certain fears, certain ideas about what success looks like, about what love should feel like, about what makes someone worthy. Even our nervous system begins learning about the world long before we're capable of explaining what it's learning. As children, we don't usually stop to analyze our environment. We absorb it, we learn what brings connection, we learn what creates conflict, we learn what makes the adults around us smile, we learn what makes them withdraw. And because children depend on the people around them to survive, adapting isn't really a choice. It's intelligence. It's one of the ways human beings stay connected. That's something I find both fascinating and strangely comforting, because it reminds me that many of the parts of ourselves we struggle with today may not have appeared out of nowhere. They probably made sense once. That doesn't necessarily mean they still serve us, but perhaps they deserve to be understood before they're judged. I think we live in a culture that often encourages us to immediately fix ourselves, find the problem, identify the weakness, replace the habit, become a better version of yourself. And while growth matters, I've started wondering whether understanding should come before improvement. Because it's difficult to change something we don't understand. And it's even harder when we're constantly criticizing ourselves for having it. Sometimes I imagine meeting a younger version of myself. Not to give advice, just to observe, to notice what that child had to learn in order to feel safe. What did they become good at? What emotions became acceptable? Which ones felt dangerous? What parts of themselves did they quietly place on a shelf because they believed they would be loved more without them? I don't think we ask those questions often enough. Not because we're avoiding them intentionally, mostly because life moves quickly. We go to work, we answer emails, we pay bills, we scroll through our phones, we make dinner, we keep moving. And underneath all of that movement, our patterns quietly continue doing what they've always done, almost unnoticed. until one day something interrupts them. Maybe a relationship, maybe a loss, maybe burnout, maybe therapy, maybe a conversation with a friend, or maybe just one simple question that refuses to leave your mind. Who taught me to become this version of myself? Not in the sense of blaming someone. I don't think this conversation is about blames. It's about curiosity, because those are very different things. Blame asks, whose fault is this? Curiosity asks, how did this happen? And I think curiosity tends to open more doors. One of the ideas that has stayed with me the most is that we don't actually choose the beginning of our story. At first, that sounds almost too obvious. Of course, we don't choose where we're born. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose our body. We don't choose the decade we arrive in. We don't choose the neighborhood or the language people speak around us. But when you really sit with that idea, it starts expanding because those things influence so much more than we often realize. Imagine two children growing up in completely different homes. In one home, making mistakes is treated as part of learning. In the other, mistakes are met with criticism. Years later, both adults may walk into the exact same situation at work. They receive constructive feedback from their manager. One thinks, that's helpful. The other immediately feels ashamed. The event was the same, the meaning wasn't. Or imagine someone who grew up feeling that love could disappear without warning. Perhaps nobody ever said those exact words. But children don't only learn through language, they learn through repetition, through presence, through absence, through tone of voice, through what consistently happens. If affection arrives unpredictably, maybe the child begins watching every small change in someone's expression, not because they're dramatic, because they're adapting. Years later, as an adult, they may find themselves constantly analyzing text messages, facial expressions, or pauses in conversation. They might even call themselves an overthinker. But maybe that's not where the story began. Maybe overthinking wasn't the original pattern. Maybe paying close attention once helped them feel prepared. Maybe it reduced uncertainty. Maybe it was an intelligent response to an environment that felt unpredictable. I find that incredibly compassionate, not because it excuses every behavior, but because it reminds us that many patterns have logic, even if they no longer serve us. I think we sometimes forget that our minds are remarkably creative when they're trying to keep us safe. If asking for help once led to disappointment, perhaps independence became protection. If expressing emotions led to rejection, perhaps silence became protection. If achievement brought praise, perhaps perfection became protection. When we only look at the adult behavior, it's easy to criticize it. Why am I like this? But maybe there's another question, a gentler one. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what was this part of me trying to protect? I don't know about you, but that question changes something inside me. It doesn't magically solve anything. It doesn't erase responsibility, but it replaces judgment with understanding. And I think understanding is often where meaningful change begins. Because once we understand why a pattern exists, we're no longer fighting ourselves. We're listening. And sometimes, I wonder if that's what many of us have been missing all along. Not another strategy, not another productivity system, not another way to optimize ourselves. Maybe we've simply forgotten how to become curious about the person we've already become. The more I sat with this idea, the more another question started to surface. If so much of our behavior is shaped by what we've experienced, what about the things we want? That one feels a little more uncomfortable. Because our desires feel deeply personal. When I say I want something, it certainly feels like it comes from the deepest part of me. It feels authentic, it feels obvious. But does it always? I'm not so sure. Sometimes I wonder how many of my ambitions are genuinely mine, and how many were quietly handed to me before I was old enough to question them. Think about it for a moment. How do we decide what success looks like? Where did that picture come from? Was it something we discovered through experience? Or something we absorbed from watching the adults around us? Maybe success meant having a stable career because stability wasn't guaranteed growing up. Maybe it meant becoming wealthy because money always felt scarce. Maybe it meant never needing anyone because depending on people once felt painful. Maybe it meant being admired because somewhere along the way, admiration became confused with being lovable. None of those desires are wrong, but they're not always the whole story either. I've noticed that sometimes we chase one thing while quietly hoping it will give us something else entirely. We think we're pursuing achievement when what we're really searching for is security. We think we're pursuing independence when what we're actually protecting ourselves from is disappointment. We think we're pursuing recognition, when underneath it all, we simply want to feel seen. And those are very different journeys. Because if I misunderstand what I'm actually longing for, I may spend years climbing the wrong mountain. The strange thing is that society rarely encourages us to ask those deeper questions. Instead, we're constantly surrounded by images of what a meaningful life is supposed to look like. We're told what beauty should be, what productivity should be, what relationships should be, what happiness should look like, what milestones we're expected to reach by a certain age. And after hearing those messages long enough, they can start to sound like our own voice. I don't think culture only shapes our opinions. I think it shapes our imagination. It quietly teaches us which dreams seem worth dreaming. One of the ideas that stayed with me from all of this is that culture doesn't simply tell us what to do, it also teaches us who to become. In some parts of the world, people grow up hearing messages like follow your passion, find yourself, be unique, stand out. Identity becomes something deeply individual, almost like a project. You're expected to discover who you really are and express that person as authentically as possible. But there are other cultures where the questions sound very different. Instead of asking, who am I? Someone might ask, what do I owe my family? How can I contribute to my community? What responsibilities have I inherited? Neither perspective is automatically better than the other. They simply remind me that even the questions we ask about ourselves aren't universal. They come from somewhere. That realization surprised me because I'd always assumed the search for identity was something every human experienced in roughly the same way. But perhaps that's not true. Perhaps even my desire to find myself has been shaped by the world I happen to grow up in. And if that's true, then identity becomes much more than personality. It becomes history, it becomes family, it becomes language, it becomes religion, and it becomes economics. It becomes generations of people handing stories to one another, some consciously, many unconsciously. I find that oddly beautiful because it reminds me that none of us exist in isolation. We carry pieces of people we'll never meet, our grandparents' fears, our parents' hopes, the values of our neighborhoods, the assumptions of our generation, the technology we grew up with, the music that surrounded us, the historical moment we happen to be born into. All of that quietly participates in becoming us. Which brings me back to the original question, how much of me was ever mine? Maybe that's not really the right question anymore. Maybe a better question is, what have I mistaken for me simply because I've carried it for so long? There's something incredibly freeing about asking that, not because it gives us immediate answers, but because it creates a little space between ourselves and the stories we've inherited. And sometimes that small amount of space changes everything. The idea I keep returning to more than any other is where choice actually begins. For a long time, I believed freedom meant controlling my reactions. I thought that if I were truly emotionally mature, I wouldn't get defensive. I wouldn't feel anxious. I wouldn't overthink. I wouldn't become frustrated. I'd simply choose the right response every time. But life hasn't worked that way. Maybe you've noticed that too. Something happens. Someone says a certain sentence. Someone forgets to call. An unexpected email arrives. A disagreement begins. And before we've consciously decided anything, our body has already responded. Our chest tightens. Our stomach sinks. Our thoughts start racing. We become quiet, or defensive, or overly accommodating, or distant. It's almost as if something older than our conscious mind steps in first. I don't think that first response is always a decision. It often feels more like recognition, like the nervous system saying, I know this feeling. I've been here before. Whether or not the current situation is actually the same, the body remembers something familiar. I find that fascinating because it means our first reaction isn't necessarily the most truthful one. Sometimes it's simply the fastest one, the one that's been practiced the longest, the one that helped us before. That doesn't make it bad, it just makes it understandable. And perhaps that's where agency becomes much smaller than we usually imagine. Not smaller in importance, smaller in size. Maybe freedom isn't found in preventing the first reaction from happening. Maybe freedom appears a moment later, in the pause. It's such a tiny space that we often miss it. A trigger happens, the old story begins, the familiar emotion arrives, and then, if we're paying attention, there's a brief moment where awareness catches up. I've experienced that more times than I can count. I'll notice myself preparing to withdraw from someone, or assuming the worst, or trying to solve a problem that nobody actually asked me to solve. And for a split second, I realize, oh, I'm doing that thing again. Nothing has changed externally. The situation is exactly the same, but internally, something important has happened. I'm no longer completely inside the pattern and I'm looking at it. That difference feels small, but I think it changes everything. Because if I can see the pattern, then maybe I don't have to become the pattern. The first response says, this is what I learned. The second response quietly asks, is this still true? I love that question. Not because it's easy to answer, but because it doesn't demand perfection. It only asks for honesty. Is this belief still true? Does this protection still protect me? Is this fear describing the present or remembering the past? Those questions don't erase the emotion. Sometimes the fear is still there. Sometimes the sadness remains. Sometimes the insecurity doesn't disappear overnight. But perhaps freedom was never about eliminating those feelings. Perhaps freedom is learning that we can experience them without automatically handing them the steering wheel. I think that's a much gentler understanding of change, not becoming someone entirely different, not pretending we've transcended every wound, simply noticing what rises within us and deciding little by little what we want to keep practicing. Because after all, every pattern we've repeated has become familiar through repetition. Maybe new ways of relating to ourselves become familiar the very same way, not all at once, just one pause at a time. As I was thinking about all of this, I realized something. If someone had asked me a few years ago, "Who are you?" I probably would have answered with a list. I would have talked about my personality, the things I liked, the things I was good at, the things I struggled with, maybe even the mistakes I kept making. But now, I'm not sure I'd answer the question the same way, because I've started wondering whether many of those descriptions were really describing me or simply describing the strategies I'd become very good at. There's a difference. One describes our essence, the other describes our adaptations. And maybe we spend much of our lives confusing the two. I don't think this realization is meant to make us question everything. It's not about becoming suspicious of every preference or every emotion. Sometimes we genuinely love what we love. Sometimes a dream really is ours. Sometimes a personality trait simply reflects our temperament. Not every part of us is a defense mechanism waiting to be uncovered, but I do think it's worth becoming a little more curious. The next time you hear yourself saying, "That's just who I am," maybe pause for a moment, not to argue with yourself, not to criticize yourself, just to wonder, is this truly who I am? Or is this someone I once had to become? Maybe the answer will be yes. Maybe you'll realize, no, this really is part of me, and that's beautiful. But perhaps another answer will surprise you. Perhaps you'll notice that the impatience, the people pleasing, the constant need to stay busy, the fear of disappointing everyone, or the habit of always expecting the worst weren't personality traits at all. Maybe they were brilliant solutions. Solutions created by a younger version of you who was simply trying to navigate the world with the tools they had available. I find that perspective incredibly compassionate because it allows us to appreciate those patterns without letting them permanently define us. Instead of saying, "Why am I like this?" Perhaps we can ask, "When did this become necessary?" Those feel like very different conversations. One begins with criticism, the other begins with understanding. And I don't know about you, but I think understanding tends to create more space for change than criticism ever does. There's another reflection that has stayed with me throughout all of this. Sometimes we put a tremendous amount of pressure on ourselves to completely reinvent who we are. We imagine healing as becoming an entirely different person, more confident, more disciplined, more fearless, more emotionally regulated, almost as though we're trying to replace ourselves with an upgraded version. But I don't think that's what this conversation has been pointing toward. Maybe healing isn't becoming someone new. Maybe it's becoming less governed by patterns we never consciously chose. There's something gentler about that. Less dramatic, less exhausting. It's not asking us to erase our history. It's inviting us to understand it, to notice it, to hold it with a little more compassion. And then, when the opportunity presents itself, to choose our next response with slightly more awareness than the last one. Not perfectly, just honestly. Because awareness doesn't erase conditioning overnight, but it does begin changing our relationship with it. And perhaps that relationship is where freedom quietly grows. There's one more question I can't seem to let go of. If so much of who we are has been shaped by biology, family, culture, memory, relationships, and experience, then what, if anything, remains underneath all of that? This is where psychology begins touching philosophy, and where philosophy sometimes brushes against spirituality. Many traditions describe something deeper than personality. Some call it the soul, some call it awareness, some speak of consciousness, others simply talk about the observing self. I'm not sure anyone can prove exactly what that is, and honestly, I'm okay with not knowing. I think some questions are valuable precisely because they stay open. Because if personality can change, if habits can change, if beliefs can change, if our understanding of ourselves continues changing throughout life, then who is the one noticing all those changes? Who is the one asking these questions in the first place? And I don't have an answer, but I find myself returning to that mystery again and again, not because I need certainty, but because good questions have a way of making us pay closer attention, and maybe that's enough. So I find myself coming back to the same question we started with: how much of me was ever mine? I still don't know. And strangely, I feel less interested in finding a final answer than I did when I first started asking it. Because maybe mine doesn't mean untouched. Maybe nothing human is untouched. Maybe every one of us is shaped by countless things we never consciously chose. The families we were born into, the stories we inherited, the fears we absorbed, the love we received, the love we didn't, the places we grew up, the time in history we happened to arrive. Perhaps all of those things become the raw materials of a life, but raw materials aren't the finished work. Maybe what becomes ours is the relationship we slowly develop with everything we've inherited. The way we question it, the way we understand it, the way we forgive the parts that once protected us, the way we stop confusing survival with identity, and the way we gently ask ourselves, what do I want to continue practicing from here? I don't think we choose our first self. I think we wake up inside it, but perhaps over time, through honesty, through compassion, through awareness, we begin participating in the next one. And I think there's something deeply hopeful about that. Not because it promises we'll become perfect, but because it reminds us that our story isn't finished. Every moment of awareness becomes another sentence, another paragraph, another page. And maybe becoming ourselves isn't about discovering someone who has been hiding inside us all along. Maybe it's about slowly learning which parts were inherited, which parts were necessary, and which parts we'd like to keep carrying forward. If today's conversation resonated with you, you can find the full written article on Asriel's Substack, where each topic is explored in greater depth. If you'd like to continue these conversations, consider subscribing, sharing this episode with someone who might need it, or leaving a review. It truly helps this work reach the people who are looking for it. Until next time, take care of your mind, stay curious, and keep paying attention to the quiet places within yourself.